Yeah.
Hey, Karsten.
Hey.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Pedro. Good to see
Hi.
you.
Nice to
Yeah,
meet you.
So happy that you guys agreed to have this conversation with me, and I really look forward to it.
yeah, likewise. My exposure to Martinus was just through you, Karsten, and really appreciated what you shared, probably a year ago at this point. And Pedro, I assume this was your first encounter with Martinus's work as well, right?
Yeah, these past few weeks, since I connected with Karsten on Substack, I've really been enjoying what I've read, and Karsten has been giving me recommendations, and I've been reading them, and I've been just kind of amazed by the affinities between Martinus and Bergson. Um, and so yeah, I've been really enjoying what you've been giving us.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I was able to read both his sort of autobiographical account
Yeah,
and the piece on time, space, and eternity.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, lots that we could dig into. Um,
I was thinking, I mean, this meeting came about because I reacted to your essay about Whitehead's theology.
mhm,
So I was thinking a good starting point could be that you kind of just briefly outline Whitehead's idea of the Godhead and the kind of role that it plays in his cosmological scheme, and then we could take it from there because I was baffled by the kind of resonances that I saw between Whitehead's theology and the way that Martinus is thinking about the Godhead. Um, because they are you couldn't think of two persons who are more different in terms of uh, background and what their kind of epistemic sources are and so on. So I thought that
mm,
was quite interesting. That was kind of what triggered me to reach out to you.
mm. Yeah, and I can try to do that briefly. And I felt the resonances too. Um, Martinez has these three X's, this Trinitarian structure, and I feel like that maps pretty well onto Whitehead. So, in Whitehead's so-called process theology, he describes the ultimate uh, groundless ground, you could say, as creativity. And God is, he says, the first creature of creativity. Elsewhere, he calls God the primordial accident of creativity. And God is dipolar for Whitehead. So there's this primordial pole, which is God's mental pole. It is God envisaging creativity and giving it some form and some uh, value vector, you could say. So whereas creativity is just pure possibility, infinite potential, God in God's primordial nature values that possibility in some way, so as to give it a tilt towards a particular end, a particular aesthetic orientation, you could say. Um, and then God's consequent nature, the other pole, or the physical pole, I would say, of God, is God's response to the way that the all of the creatures of the physical world respond to the primordial envisagement. And so this consequent pole of God is something like a cosmic memory, and it grows with the universe, whereas the primordial pole of God is unchanging. But in this picture for Whitehead, God is subject to creativity, just like every other creature is subject to creativity. Um, and every creature, finite creature, also has these two poles, a physical and a mental pole. And for Whitehead, the only real difference between the divine concrescence and a natural concrescence or a finite creature is the order of the poles. And so God's mental pole, the primordial pole, precedes God's physical pole, whereas finite occasions of experience their concrescence unfolds physical first and then mental as the consequent. And so there's that slight inversion, many other details and whatnot that I could unpack. But right on the surface, it seems to me that what Martinus describes as X1, X2, X3, or X1 as the I, the sort of uncreated, eternal, is akin somewhat to Whitehead's creativity. The primordial nature of God seems akin to X2, this sort of creative power to manifest something definite. And then X3, that which is created, seems very much like the consequent nature of God, but also the physical universe, which is what God is in the consequent nature responding to. Right. So this Trinitarian structure seems to be present in both of their thought, that they've converged on a similar picture. So
yeah, I think I mean the kind of overall resonance I see between both Martinus, Whitehead, and Bergson is that they think in terms of organism rather than mechanism. That's something very basic. But also Martinus, like Whitehead, he sees God as an experiential creature. So God is not just the creator, but God is having an experience. And there's a kind of interaction going on between the one, the Godhead, and all the, you could say, sons of God, all the individual creatures. There's a mutual dependence, according to Martinus. So God is not this sovereign kind of existing above creation, but he's taking part in creation, and he's actually or he or she. It's, I mean, there's no sex here, but the Godhead is taking part in the experience of all beings, according to Martinus, and all beings have the role, in a sense, of providing the Godhead with experience. So, for example, our suffering, the Godhead will also take part in our suffering, the way Martinus sees it. I mean, I get what you're saying about this Trinitarian structure, and I also see the kind of resonance there. They're kind of inspired by this mytho-poetic language of Christianity, both of them. But I've been thinking, so I remember you wrote in this essay, you wrote that for Whitehead, the ultimate ontological category is creativity. And I guess in one sense you could say that in Martinus also, but in another sense I would say that for Martinus, the ultimate ontological category is the living being. And every living being, not only the Godhead, but every living being has this kind of Trinitarian structure. So every living being is both creator, it's in the process of creation, and it's something manifest. There's an organism. So you cannot think of a being without an organism, but you cannot think of a living being either without the living being being in this process of creation, but also, in a sense, being the creator. And this is where Martinus, he talks about what he calls the I, and the way he talks about the I is something like Fichte. The I is universal. It's not the I that makes us different. Actually, the I is our access point to the whole cosmos, you could say. It's where we have, it's kind of a shared identity we have with all other beings and with the Godhead as well. So what makes us individual is not the I, but it's rather the creative process. I mean, in one of these this autobiographical article, Martinus was talking about what he calls the golden baptism of fire. where you have this experience of being without an organism, without any kind of spatio-temporal structures, but he's just in this ocean of golden rays of light, and he's feeling one with the with all of say the whole universe, the whole cosmos, all living beings. He's feeling this commonality, and I think what he's experiencing there is kind of it's the say it's the point of bifurcation. It's where the one becomes the many, and the many becomes the one. And so it's the creative process, which is it's creating the manifold, it's creating the and it's not create it's we're not talking about a point in time where the manifold was created, but we're talking about something happening all the time. It's like a continual recreation of the manifold.
Mhm.
I think, yeah, I just want to add one thing more. So Martinus, when he's talking about the cosmos, he's kind of talking about two axes along which you can analyze the cosmos. So there's a horizontal axis and a vertical one, and he actually uses the symbol of he's seeing the cross as a symbol of these two modes of exploration. So on the vertical axis, this is where you have kind of the dichotomy between the unmanifest, say, source of creation and that which is manifested. And this is where you need intuition, according to him, to come into contact with the creative process happening, say, behind the scene, so to speak, and that kind of unmanifest, nameless something that is the source of creation. So that's one axis. But then you can also explore the cosmos horizontally. And this is where he goes into all the different, say, living structures that we can experience in the universe. And this is where natural science has its say, explorative field or field of research. So this is where Martinus will describe the evolution from the microcosmos to the macrocosmos, and how before we were organisms, we were organs in his evolutionary scheme. Before we were organs or our organ systems, we were cells. Before that, we were something like molecules, organic molecules or something like that. And then you can go on infinitely, sorry, down into the microcosm. And the same, the planet is a living being, the solar system is a living being, the galaxy is a living being, but that also goes on upwards. So he has kind of an expanded evolutionary scheme in terms of how we normally talk about it. But he's kind of keeping these two axes separate in his, say, exploration of the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots comes to mind there, but I want to give Pedro a chance to maybe connect with this material a bit, maybe from the Bergsonian point of view, or just, your own experience of, the interface between mysticism, philosophy, and science. How did these texts by Martinus speak to you?
Yeah, I just felt a lot of, especially when he talked about intuition resonance with Bergson, especially how Bergson talks about mysticism as the pinnacle of moral life in the two sources of morality and religion. He doesn't talk about it so much for me, it's funny. I'm still, just finished reading this text for the first time and reading a supplemental text as well, a commentary. But the way he frames it is that um, kind of anthropocentric, but I think it makes sense in the sense that he sees human beings as kind of the point of evolution. But what I take that to mean is that it's through um, humanity that the vital impetus comes to be aware of itself. And so he devotes a section of the two sources of morality and religion to talk about mysticism as basically the greatest achievement in the history of evolution, is how he reads it. And so, like, for example, he identifies Christian mysticism as the highest point in it, which I think can be debated because he maybe simplifies, for example, Buddhism a little bit, or maybe even Greek philosophy. Like he says, Plotinus gets to ecstasy, he reaches contemplation, but Bergson claims it's not translated into action like it is for the Christian mystics, which knew Plotinus way better than I did. So maybe there's something to that. Um, in Buddhism, I think there are engaged traditions of Buddhism that maybe go against his critique of Buddhism as not being as active as the Christian mystics. Um, but that is the resonance that I find in that he says, so there's 2 points in evolution that he contrasts to make his point. So in the Hymenoptera, which are basically ants, wasps, bees, um, he sees evolution pushing an instinct to its highest degree, in the sense that like in a bee society, everybody works as if they were in sync, as if sometimes they were a single organism. Um, and whereas human beings push intelligence, so in human beings, intelligence is at its most fully formed in evolution. And so he contrasts that with bees, and that there's a similarity there in that both instinct and in the evolutionary process, we see like huge societies best exemplified in human beings and in the Hymenoptera. But the difference with human beings is that whereas instinct is a direct contact with life itself, according to Bergson, such that you wouldn't say that a bee is conscious of what it's doing. It just is, its consciousness and the hive consciousness are one thing. For human beings and intelligence is it is a it's directed in the same way, in the sense that instinct for the bees allows them to manipulate skillfully their environment. And intelligence for human beings works in the same way. It's something that it's a form of consciousness that evolution uses to manipulate matter. But for human beings, what intelligence also does is it threatens social cohesion, in that it creates more of a sense of I-ness. Intelligence makes the human being more self-contained. It's essentially what makes our freedom possible compared to the instinct of the Hymenoptera. And so this is where Bergson says morality comes from, is that instinct has to subterraneously intervene in order to defend from the pressures of intelligence that tend to separate the individual from society. That, for Bergson, is the organic origin of morality. But then something new happens in that, whereas for human morality begins as just about being for social cohesion and maintenance of the tribe and relations, he identifies in great moral figures like Jesus, for example, and probably Martinus, if he knew him, the vital impetus. There's the intervention of instinct, such that intelligence, which separates the human being from I guess you could say, the flow of life around it, from having immediate contact with life. Intelligence, he says, can be refined by instinct, such that you create intuition. And so it's similar to instinct in the sense that it puts us in touch with reality, with the flow of life once again. But it's different from the instinct of the bees in that it's self-conscious of itself. And that, for Bergson, is what mysticism is. And so he doesn't talk about it as something teleological. It's not like the vital impetus had planned this, but there is something genuinely new that occurs with with mystical experiences that typically the message that's given by people that have these experiences is that we need to expand beyond a closed society or a closed form of religion and morality in order to have a brotherhood of humanities, the way he puts it. So the message here is of universal love, typically, and that's he sees that as a completely new and novel evolution in the history of um, life. But he says that if he argues that this is essentially what the vital impetus is trying to do, and he identifies the vital impetus with God. But clearly, this is not God in the same sense we're used to. He sees it God as the creative principle behind all of life. And so I see a lot of similarities also here with Martinus in that, and also that you're talking about the cross in terms of what it sounds like you're saying is that the vertical or horizontal part of the cross is more like space, the domain of natural science, and this is more like time. In Bergson, intelligence in human beings is what allows for science, and the form of the way that intelligence relates to the world is through analysis. We don't intelligence doesn't relate to the world as it is in terms of movement. It arrests movement in order to analyze it into concepts and then recreate um, the world in terms of its static concepts, which is extremely helpful for manipulating nature. Intelligence is ultimately directed towards the manipulation of matter, um, but it doesn't get to things as they are, which can only be done through intuition and essentially a form of mysticism where there's a direct contact between the soul and the world.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. It strikes me that this shift from among human beings from intelligence to intuition as a result of instinct becoming conscious of itself is this akin to this shift where rather than, as Karsten was saying, our sense of ourselves as an I becomes what separates us from one another, but rather opens out into this common sort of spiritual emptiness or plenum of our participation in the Godhead as both one and many. But the I intuitively is what actually makes us the same rather
Yeah.
than what makes us different. And it's, mysticism is full of these paradoxes. But that one struck me as especially significant. And yeah, this analysis of time in Martinus definitely reminded me of Bergson because like Martinus was pointing out how you can't see time. It's not physically manifest. Movement is manifest, which already brings you into space. But you have to get like sort of behind, I should say the movement of objects is in space, but if you can get behind that to a more primal movement, you know, um, creative advance in Whitehead sense or duration in Bergson sense, that's already our participation in a spiritual reality. And I feel like it's the most obvious way in which our experience and our consciousness as human beings, the stream of thought is already spiritual. And it doesn't require really speculating about another world beyond this world. It's just the very way in which we perceive this world. If we can reflect upon that process of perception itself, we discover duration, lived time, this creative flow that's irreducible to any material objects, right? And it just feels like such an obvious phenomenological redirection to liberate us from the trap of a materialistic way of thinking, where, in order to affirm a kind of, crass materialism, which I think very few people actually do when it comes down to it, but it's a very seductive um, mode of thought and worldview for people who are very intelligent. Um, but in order to become seduced by that, it's like you have to forget that you're the one having this experience. You have to just totally background the fact that none of these objects in space get measured unless there's someone there to measure them.
Yeah.
And what um yeah, how is measurement possible? It's like you have to ask this sort of transcendental question in order to seemingly quite easily just um, lift yourself out of that materialistic trap, that delusion. So it's just I think it's a very easy way into a spiritual worldview that doesn't require anything more than just a little bit of self-reflection.
Yeah. The first time that I encountered the idea of that Carson mentioned about Fichte, that the I is what um, makes us actually is the universal, not the individual, was we've talked about this, Matt, like in Cannibal Metaphysics by Viveiros de Castro, um, where there's this really cool anecdote from Levi Strauss that when the European explorers first went to North America, they captured a native from there, and they were wondering, and their question was, well, do they have a soul? Can we, teach them Christianity? So their question was, does this native have a soul like we do? But from the other point of view, the natives captured a human being and they just assumed, yes, it has a soul. Everybody has a soul. That's what makes us the same. But they tested, will this human's body rot? Like, is this body organic? So just very interesting, the difference in point of view, and that the body was a given for the Europeans. The question was, do they have a soul? For the natives, everybody has an eye. That's the universal. But is this body a real body, right? So that was a very instructive example for me.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about what you've been sharing, but the thing you talk about, Pedro, with instinct, intelligence, and intuition, Martinus has a similar analysis. So he has what you could call a kind of cosmic faculty psychology. So he has a very strong suggestion, namely that all manifest phenomena can be explained as a combination of six basic, he calls it energies or basic faculties of consciousness. It's both. It's both something we can observe in nature, but we can also observe it in ourselves. And these six basic faculties he calls instinct, gravity. That needs a little explanation, but because it's not gravity like physicists think about it, but he calls it instinct, gravity, feeling, intelligence, intuition, and memory. So instinct, gravity, feeling, intelligence, intuition, and memory. According to Martinus, all phenomena can be explained as some combination of these six faculties. And the only thing I'll say about gravity right now is that it's the energy that is dominating on the physical plane. So it's the kind of dominating energy or faculty when we're in in a physical body. And of course, it's part of the picture here that Martinus believes that all beings have a material organism, but it's not necessarily physical. There are more subtle forms of matter that you can kind of incarnate in that cannot be experienced by physical senses, but that's another story. But so for example, if you take instinct and intelligence, they're, according to Martinus, opposite to each other. And he would agree with Bergson of his analysis that you can have these societies where the whole organization of the society is based on kind of an instinctive contact with reality. And so intelligence, he says it's not an experiential faculty, but it's an analytical, it's purely analytical. It does influence our experiences because it can organize memories into what he calls force fields of recognition. So we can use intelligence to kind of strengthen our ability to recognize something as something in particular. But then he says about intuition, he says actually it's an automatized faculty of analysis.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, and also I know Bergson is talking about intellectual sympathy as a kind of precursor, you could say, for the intuitive experience. You need some kind of intellectual sympathy for whatever it is you want to inquire into, to have this kind of intuitive experience from within. And Martinus would say something similar. So the sympathy in his vocabulary or terminology is kind of synonymous with feeling. So what he calls feeling is basically sympathy. And so he's talking about both intelligence being harmonized by feeling, and feeling, that's also where we have our sense of value. But he will also talk about feeling becoming harmonized by intelligence. And the thing about feeling, if it's not harmonized by intelligence, we tend to favor some things over other things. That there's a kind of favorism or partiality in our approach to reality. I mean, it's a bit like Bergson when he talks about when we have a particular interest, that's kind of different from the kind of disinterested engagement that we need to experience something intuitively. So Martinus is talking about that as well. So he sees the way that he talks about intuition, it's different from instinct in the sense that it's intellectualized, and it's kind of it kind of grows out of this balance you have between intelligence and feeling, and also he has a kind of psychological analysis where he said that people whose life of feeling is dominated by the intelligence tend to be materialists, whereas people whose intelligence is dominated by their feeling life, they tend to be kind of spiritualists. And so you need a balance between the two, according to Martinus, to allow for intuition to kick in. And there's another, I think, interesting similarity between Bergson and Martinus, and also I think this is what distinguishes them both from Whitehead, as I've come to know him in this very beautiful little essay called The Function of Reason. But they use some of the same spatial metaphors to describe intuition. So they both talk about the intuitive insight as coming from within, but also in some sense being within the object that you acquire insight into. So it's like with intuition, you can experience what it's like to be something, like what it's like to be a bat, to use a famous phrase. You can experience that intuitively. And according to Martinus, you can even experience what it's like to be the kind of being that produce mineral matter in the physical world. So when you have this intuitive capacity, you can acquire insights into all things as life, what he calls life utterances. But the other metaphor he uses, that Bergson also uses, is that Bergson, he has this analysis where he says that no matter how many concepts you have or descriptions of a phenomena, you can never ascend from all these concepts and description to an intuition. But given you have the intuition, you can descend into the world of concepts and descriptions. And an intuition it's kind of inexhaustible. There's no limit to how many concepts you can produce to describe what you've experienced once you've had the intuition. Mm. And so Martinus would also use this spatial metaphor, and he would talk about sensing from above, and he would oppose it to the kind of explorative mode you're in, say, in natural science, that he would call sensing from below. So that's kind of an ascending path. And so you have a descending, which is once you have the intuition. And this is actually what Martinus did. I mean, he had his intuitions early on, but it actually took him something like 6 or 7 years to learn how to express these intuitive insights conceptually and analytically. And for that, he says that he had to use imagination. So he said about imagination that it's the ability to connect a higher insight with our everyday experiences. And so he had to learn how to use his imaginative faculty to express his ideas. That wasn't just there from day one. Mm. This is where I think I really love this essay about Whitehead about the function of reason is so rich. And it's kind of a defense for speculative reason, but also for applying methodology in speculative reasoning. And I think you must comment on that, Matt, but I think it seems like Whitehead is more on this kind of ascending path, in a sense, where he wants to, he's seeing the way we make progress in science and philosophy and metaphysics as this process where we gradually acquire more clarity in propositional content and more consistency and so on. Whereas I think what Bergson and Martinus is talking about is that you can have that instantly once you have this kind of intuitive insight. But maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's the difference with Whitehead is he comes out of William James's tradition of radical empiricism, and so he wants to start his approach to doing speculative metaphysics and cosmology is to start with what the special sciences have discovered and generalize, and not just the special sciences, but the arts, aesthetics, religious experience, and sort of generalize from the full spectrum of human experience to arrive at that set of concepts and categories that would be universally adequate to describe everything, right? And what you're saying about the sort of top-down and bottom-up approaches that Martinus highlights, and I think is also present in Bergson. I mean, this goes back to Plotinus's reading of Plato's two methods. There's myth and dialectic. And if I recall correctly, it's myth, this sort of imaginative participation in the divine order of things that allows us to move from that oneness to the manyness of our incarnated existence, whereas dialectic begins with the manyness and through this process of reasoning allows us to ascend back. And you need both of these methods from the Platonic point of view to sort of coordinate best around what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. But, I think in terms of what Martinus means by intelligence and what Bergson means by intellect, that there's a bit of terminological sliding going on there that I think they mean different things. And I wonder if it's related to, going back to Plato again, these two different forms of two different ways that we can access the intelligible domain as opposed to the sensible domain. I mean, in the sensible domain, we have just bare sensation, and then we have belief and opinion, or doxa, about those sensations. But then you cross that line into the intelligible, and there's also these two different ways, dianoia and noēsis. In Kant, in German, I think these are basically equivalent to Verstand and Vernunft, understanding and reason. Or we could use um, noēsis is like intuition, and dianoia is like intellect, in the sense that Bergson might mean them. And so I think what Martinus is talking about as intelligence, it might actually be closer to what Kant and that tradition would mean by Vernunft, reason. I'm not sure about that, but I think we don't want to.
I mean, I think actually think something like the way that he talks about intelligence is something like a computer, simply.
So more like the understanding then.
Yeah,
Understand.
more like the understanding. So
Right.
intelligence, it's a purely.
Ah,
I mean, there's one place in Livesbo 1. Livesbo means Book of Life, but he wanted, that's his capital work in 7 volumes, but he wanted the Danish title to be used in all languages. So in Livesbo 1, there's a small analysis of this faculty of intelligence, and it almost looks like a description of a Turing machine.
oh, interesting. Okay.
So it's extremely, and the way he talks about it is that he uses image where he says just like you can grab different. I mean, if I have a desk and it's disordered, I can clean it up. I can put certain papers in one stack and others in another, and so on. And he said we can do that mentally as well with our memories. So once I mean, the sensations we have are kind of disordered. And so intelligence is the faculty we use to put order and to group impressions in what he calls these force fields of recognition.
Oh yeah. So this is Verstand, understanding and sense, the
Yeah,
categorization and analysis of.
sure, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I think Vernunft, that would more be like this intellectualized feeling.
Uh-huh.
And once you combine intelligence and feeling, and harmonize them
Right.
in a kind of that would be more like Vernunft, I would say, because that's kind of the precursor for intuition. You need, if you don't have this harmonization, and the way he speaks about it is that during our daily struggle of life, we evolve our intelligence, and also you can go to school and so on to become more intelligent. Intelligent is something you can train, he says, but feeling, there you need experiences from the, say, hard knocks of life. So basically what nurtures the development of our feeling, our capacity for feeling, which is also, it's also compassion in his terminology. That's through suffering. So the deeper meaning of suffering is actually that it nourishes our humanity, our humane values and so on, and these are all based in what he calls feeling. So he's talking about, yeah, so I guess intellectualized feeling would be more akin to what the German idealists call Vernunft.
This has made me think. I don't know basic Kant, but I have a really good friend whom I consider a mentor. That we're beginning to work on a paper on Bergson and Karl Jaspers. I don't know how familiar you are with Karl Jaspers. I only know what I've learned through my friend Maggie. But
No, he coined the term axial age.
Axial age.
yes, yeah. And there's a book, I haven't started reading it yet. So I'm no expert on it, only know what Maggie introduced about it to me. But I'm about to read Reason and Anti-Reason in Our Times by Carl Jaspers, where he talks about the ethical function of reason. And to my limited understanding, because again, I haven't read it yet, only talked about it, is that the ethical function of reason isn't just meant to lead to a sort of, I guess when people talk about reason being rational, it's an instrumentalized form of reason in the sense that it's purely associated with what Bergson would call analysis, but that the ethical function of reason is also to sensitize us to other people and develop compassion, kind of in the same way I think about how in the Parmenides, Parmenides tells Socrates that he has to basically learn dialectic and meet people where they're at when he's speaking with them, and that we're, I think, missing a lot when we talk about reason, its ethical function as well, which goes to, I think, the priority of intellect and analysis over intuition and metaphysics. And that also connects to, I think, something probably the central theme of mysticism, which is love, in the sense that I'm coming into reading about the ethical function of reason with my opinion that you can't really divorce our that part of the cultivation of reason isn't just to be instrumental, mathematical, or scientific, but also to develop compassion and sensitize us to the world in the intuitive sense that Bergson talks about. And so I think it'd be interesting to think about the relationship between love and reason, or the ethical function of reason. But just wanted to throw that out there, that I wanted to get eventually to thinking about where love plays in mysticism for Bergson, Martinus is central. I know less about Whitehead. I saw in your what we read, Whitehead's Whitehead's theology, that love is central there too, but I'm not sure if it's in a similar sense as it is for Bergson and for Martinus. So I just kind of wanted to throw all that out there.
I mean, for Martinus, intellectualized feeling is another word for love.
Okay.
And so it's, again, it's about, I mean, we can have illogical sympathies. I mean, if you're addicted to something, for example, or if you're in love, and so this person is fantastic, but all the rest of the world kind of fades into the gray area. And these are what you would call illogical sympathies, because they favor something or something other. So when we talk universal love, it's feeling, but it's intellectualized, so as to kind of balance it out and acquire an interest in all things without exception. So for Martinus, love is it's the kind of moral habitus you need to evolve before you can hope to become intuitive. Intuition is kind of a gift to the person who, through experience of life and reflecting on experiences of life, have acquired this kind of moral habitus of love, unconditional love for all things, for life itself in all its different manifestations. So, and it's extremely central to Martinus. So he would call love he calls it the basic tone of the universe. And also he wants to redeem evil. It's not there's good and there's evil in a sense, but they are kind of relative to each other, and they are part of kind of a higher good. So in a sense, it's how can I explain it? I mean, it's all about experience, and it's all about, so he has something he calls creational principles, which are kind of aesthetic principles that you need for that needs to be in place for experience to happen. So something like what he calls the principle of contrast. Without good and evil, there couldn't be any kind of experience. Without light and darkness, there's another principle he calls the principle of hunger and satiation. So we need some kind of direction to have an experience where we long for some things, and then we become satiated, and we perhaps long for that which is the contrast to that of which we are satiated. There's also something he calls, I mean, the kind of core of these creational principles is what he calls a primordial desire, which is, I guess that's a term you find in Fichte as well. So all living creatures, I mean, that's part of creation, that it's driven by this primordial desire. But interestingly enough, he also says that this primordial desire, it's kind of determined from below. I mean, it's nourished from our actual experiences. It's not, I mean, so it's not like a cause effect, a linear cause effect relationship. There is a primordial desire, but it kind of acquire its content from our actual experiences.
That's very much like both Whitehead and Schelling, actually. And Schelling would talk about, I mean, in a proto-Nietzschean way, Schelling says will is primal being. And with will, you can read this, it's like capital W will, a kind of divine yearning, which in Schelling is initially dark and unconscious. And similarly, Whitehead describes the primordial nature of God as a divine eros, similarly unconscious. And it's only in relationship to the becoming of the creaturely manifest world that consciousness arises. And so like that reciprocal dependence of the divine, the Godhead, and the creature that you're describing in Martinus, as I understand it, is very much present in Whitehead's process theology, where God needs the worldly creatures to become conscious. Right? This yearning is unconscious until, in a sense, reflected by and in and through the creatures that share in it. And so a lot of resonance there. And I wanted to go back for a second to intellectual or the intelligence and feeling and the combination. It reminded me of something Rudolf Steiner says about this first faculty or organ of higher cognition, imagination, in his anthroposophical account, which he describes in some places as a kind of spiritual touch, right? And also I thought of William Wordsworth, the British romantic, English romantic poet who was very important for Whitehead, where he has this beautiful line in the prelude where he says that this love, more intellectual, cannot be without imagination, which in truth is but another name for absolute strength and clearest insight, amplitude of mind and reason in her most exalted mood. So in other words, from this romantic point of view, Wordsworth point of view, reason is really imagination. Reason in its most exalted mood is imagination in this higher sense of a kind of spiritual touch or synthesis of intelligence and feeling in Martinus's sense.
I saw recently you had this conversation with Mark Gaffney and Zach Stein, where you talked about cosmoeroticism, I think you call it. And that also made me think about Martinus, because he's not using the phrase eroticism, but he's talking about what he calls the sexual principle. And that's also one of these creational principles. All living beings are pleasure seeking in a sense, and even unconditional universal love is sexual in Martinus's understanding of this concept. And actually the sexual poles he sees as fundamental for any kind of experience. So you have a manifestive pole, a kind of masculine pole through which you manifest, but also there's a receptivity, kind of a feminine pole, and all living beings have both these poles. And he would use imagery like any kind of experience is a fertilization, and then there's a period of pregnancy, and then the impression is turned into an expression. But now it's kind of impregnated, the expression is impregnated with the character of the living being receiving the impression.
Can I share one of Martinus's images
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
that I think kind of captures this sexual and organic nature? I mean, this to me looks like um like a zygote, like a fertilized egg, a world,
Yeah,
as it were,
it does. Yeah.
the eternal world picture, he calls it.
Yeah.
And you have the six colors representing uh yeah, these six different energies you were describing earlier.
Yeah.
Um, and then the earth in the animal phase, orange, moving towards feeling, um, which I think similar to Steiner, he thinks in several thousand years that we'll have moved out of this.
3,000 years, he says, the majority of humanity will have moved into what he calls Christ consciousness,
Hmm.
where feeling, sympathy, compassion for all things will be the dominating say feature of our being.
Hmm.
And this is actually called his main symbol. And it was made, so he had his experience in 1921, and he made a lot of sketches before he came to this one that he later on deemed illegitimate or not correct. So it took him 6 years finally to have all things fall into place in this symbol. And he described how once he had made this symbol, he kind of, so the first years of his what he called his mission, he encountered a lot of resistance. These were very tough times for him. But once he finished this symbol, he kind of felt the blessing of the whole spiritual world. Like there was a choir of angels standing behind him singing hallelujah. And from then on until he died in 1981, he just received a lot of support from all kinds of people who support him.
Hmm.
And also you have the kind of Trinitarian principle here, where the white kind of background, that's what he calls the I X1, and the violet, what do you call it, kind of circle disc, or
Mhm.
the periphery, the violet periphery, that's creation, or the faculty of creation and experience, as he calls it. And these two together constitutes what he calls super consciousness. So they are not part of the, say, content of our experience. And then the colors, the six colors, six basic energies, kind of constitute the manifest world, which changes all the time, but it doesn't change. I mean, there's a kind of system. It's kind of, there are some limits to how it can change, which is, I guess, also where there might be some tension to process philosophy, where there is this concern, you could say, for novelty. So when you look at a picture of this and see it as a kind of evolutionary path, it's very easy to see it as something deterministic. And I don't think it is, but I think it's, I think actually process philosophy with its concern for novelty can contribute something here, and kind of to kind of see how can there be this kind of schematic structure and then still be room for novelty. But I mean, one way to explain it is like we all know that I mean, we have the daily cycle, we have the annual cycle, and although there's a lot of repetition going on in the daily cycle, for example, no 2 days are ever alike, and so you could see the kind of movement around in this cyclus is like a cosmic day, where in the animal kingdom we have the culmination of darkness, and in the kingdom where intuition is culminating, we have the midday, something like midday in the cosmic day.
Mm.
So there is this interaction, and once we're going back to the darkness again and again, because if we weren't, experience would be something that couldn't continue.
Mm.
So I just a quick question. So when Martinus says energies, so does he mean it in the sense, kind of like in the Orthodox Christian sense, that energies are emanations of the divine essence that we're able to make contact with? Like we can't really make contact with the essence, but we can, in some sense, come to know it through the energies. Is that how he means? And also, how would you distinguish it? Like, did he ever distinguish, what he means by energies versus what natural scientists mean by energy? That's something I'm curious
Or-
about, 'cause a lot of my work
Yeah.
is around that.
As for Martinus, I mean, I know you're an expert in energy, in the concept.
You're not an expert. I've spent a lot of time reading about it.
I think you've been writing about it as well, haven't you? In the concept of energy and how
Yeah, I wrote my dissertation about the history of the concept of energy, and I'm still very much interested in exploring it. And I mean, we create these concepts, right? But I'm interested right now in, among other things, like in terms of the metaphysics, what a process ontology of energy would look like. But I am concerned with, which is a question that eventually I wanted to ask you, because Martinez talks about that it's crucial, which is something that I really identified with. It's crucial that materialistic science meets spiritual science somewhere. Where that point of contact is, I don't know. My attempt is being through energy. I think maybe Matt, I don't want to speak for you, but you're, I think, trying to do something similar in terms of natural selection and evolution, reconciling the materialistic side with the impetus for evolution. Like, well, where does that come from? So for me, I'm exploring that through energy and a process ontology. So I was just curious what Martinez had to say about that.
So the energy is for Martinus synonymous with movement or vibration,
Okay.
simply. And so there are these. So it's when we're talking about different energies, we're talking about different frequencies, whereas some of them are so subtle that we cannot measure them in any way. So according to Martinus, the frequency spectrum, you could say, it goes on infinitely upwards. There's no upper limit to frequencies, but of course, what we can measure physically, there are some limits. But intuitively, you can. And I just want to add one thing here about Martinus, and this is actually why I'm interested in this conversation, because I've been studying Martinus for 34 years, I think, and the last 20 years or so I've been lecturing and writing about him. But I think in the culture around Martinus, things very easily turn into something like a collective monologue. And I think you can see some of the same things in the culture around Steiner's work, for example. So I've had for Martinus actually, he says one place that the road forward in evolution goes out of the sex and into the public sphere. And so I've had this desire for many years simply to make Martinus, say, a part of the conversation. I don't see myself as a missionary for the work of Martinus, but more like someone who wants to present him for the world so he can become a part of the dialogue and the conversation, but also so that his work can be subjected to critical scrutiny in terms of all kinds of concerns and all the discordances that you find in philosophy. in general. And one interesting thing about Martinus is that he said that, I mean, we shouldn't believe him because he had these intuitive insights, but he said that the proof of the fact that he had this intuitive insight was to be found in his cosmology. So the cosmology is the proof of the pudding, but then of course we have to inquire into it critically whether that's true or not. And for example, I think it's rather interesting in the function of reason by Whitehead that he has a number of criteria that he sets up for how we should investigate a cosmology. Things like the clarity of propositional content, what he calls internal consistency, what he calls external consistency, that is consistency with what we believe to be true in general, and so on, and also whether it actually produces a cosmological scheme. I can't remember all the details, but I like that very much because I think Martinus has something very valuable to contribute with, but I also think we should engage with him critically and not just this is what I'm missing in the culture around his work. It's so easy to agree upon him being right and kind of feeling at home with that, finding a secure spot in life where you have this feeling that you know everything because Martinus has explained everything for you. And I really try to keep myself out of that mode of engaging with his work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very familiar with that with Steiner as well. And
Yeah.
But I mean, this is one of the questions I wanted to raise in this conversation is the tension between scholarship and sort of philosophical dialogue, dialectic on the one hand, and mystical insight on the other, or clairvoyance, or the capacity to see into the spiritual world and just deliver those insights. Because as Martinus points out, in the earlier phases of his development, it was 3 years he took to not read anything philosophical or any of these spiritual texts because he wanted to make sure that his contact with Godhead and the revelations which were being dispensed were pure and not influenced by anything conceptual that he read elsewhere. But on the other hand, even if he wasn't reading during that time period, he had imbibed all sorts of things from his culture in his years of life, incarnated in his bodily form as the man that he was. And so, how do we? I mean, how can we be sure, or can we be sure that the mystical insights he has are not just by virtue of him communicating them in Danish, clothed to some degree in the cultural assumptions of his time and place, and so I feel like we have to always maintain a foot in each of these domains, the critical scholarly orientation and remaining open to mystical insight. Because if we're only in the sort of more academic analytical mindset, then we end up, you mentioned this famous essay by Thomas Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And most analytic philosophers would say, well, we can't know that. We might have our intuitions, but that's just our subjective projection and it has no bearing upon the actual experience of a bat. Whereas I think, well, we are, we share common ancestors, we're animals. Like, of course we can intuit if we make an effort to feel into and to sympathetically resonate with the experience of a bat. Of course, when we then go to try to describe that, we're going to impose our own concepts. But I don't think it's impossible to think that we could have some imaginative sympathy and put ourselves in the into the experience of a bat or any other creature or any other human being, right? So if we get too locked in the analytic mindset, we just flat out deny that anything like that is possible. And that clearly is short-sighted. But on the other hand, if we totally forego any critical distance from our uh, thought process and our seeming intuitions and just immerse ourselves in mysticism, we could become deluded, So I feel like it's important to be able to hold the tension there. And yeah, I mean, Pedro, what do you think about that? And in Bergson's work, the importance of intuition is just made perfectly clear and manifest, and how science lacks that. But then he's been criticized, and Whitehead felt the need, when he acknowledges the debt that he has to Bergson, to say at the beginning of Processing Reality that really his philosophy of organism is an attempt to save Bergson from the charge of anti-intellectualism, rightly or wrongly applied to his thought, he adds. But yeah.
I mean, you read my mind. As soon as you said, Pedro, what do you think? I was going to say, what I wanted to blurt out is that's why Bergson is a master to me. That's why I don't know. When I encountered Bergson, it was just this immediate recognition. Like, that's how he starts matter and memory. This affirms the reality of spirit and the reality of matter. And the charges of anti-intellectualism, while understandable because of the nature of what he's saying, especially in the time that he's writing, I agree with you and Whitehead, obviously, but that he was really trying to reconcile these two worlds. Like, he wasn't an anti-intellectual just because he thinks that intellect doesn't give us the highest or the direct contact with reality, or he'd even say not the highest form of knowledge. It doesn't make him an I think, intellectual. I think he's had these experiences. He's extremely well versed in the sciences of his time, in physics, in neuroscience, and mathematics. He's casually solved a problem that, what was it, Pascal, like, betrothed to us like 200 years later. He just, when he was 17, solved this mathematical problem that Pascal had left. So clearly not, he didn't disrespect science. He was really well versed in science. Wrote a whole book on relativity just to try to dialogue with Einstein, right? So this isn't someone that didn't take science seriously. So this is someone that took science very seriously, but also took very seriously the history of philosophy, spiritual life, um, essentially phenomenological experience, right? And try to not reduce one to the other, not reduce, that's what matter memory does. He criticizes idealism, and he criticizes materialism. He's not in either camp. And so I totally agree. We have to have a foot in both worlds, because I mean, reality is both these things, and we as human beings have a foot in both worlds. And so if we want to have knowledge that accurately represents what the world is like, right? It starts with acknowledging both the reality of matter and the reality of spirit. And so for me, that is Bergson's genius. I haven't seen anybody, haven't read anybody yet that has done this kind of work in the same way that Bergson did. And I think it's a shame that he went through so much scrutiny, because I wish that he had written a little more on, like, for example, theology, right? He does talk about God in the Elan Vital, but he really tried hard to never overstep empirical experience. Um, he tried really hard, like, if it steps over what he has personally experienced or empirically experienced, I don't think he ever commented on it. But it would be interesting just to go into his mind and see, if he had a little more leeway to write, for example, about the Elan Vital, or the vital impetus, what would he have said about it? And so I think it's a shame that maybe he didn't, because of his high profile and status. He probably felt like he couldn't be as speculative as maybe he maybe wanted to, but I do think he was trying to be as faithful as he could to the radical sort of empiricism of William James, for example.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah. We should
Yeah.
move towards wrapping up, but yeah, Karsten, if you want to offer some reflections, please.
Well, I just want to say that Martinus, for certain, was an anti-intellectual. He he spoke a lot about our need for natural science, although it, in his view, only gives us relative knowledge. He would call it the scent of the ocean.
Hmm.
And he would talk about philosophy as the beginning of what he called a true spiritual science. He used the Danish word, which is a translation of the German Geisteswissenschaft, Åndsvidenskab in Danish. So he saw philosophy as the beginning of a true spiritual science. He was also advocating speculative reason, the need for speculation. So I think he would also welcome what Whitehead is offering in terms of this ascending path, that we need both the descending and the ascending. Yeah, and he never wanted people just to believe him. I mean, he really invited to critical scrutiny of his ideas, but he was very confident that I guess you can read that from his autobiography, that he was the text that I sent you, that he was very confident that this would stand the test of time. But we shouldn't take his word for it. We should investigate it. So yeah, I'm just so happy that you wanted to engage in this dialogue. It's one of the best things I've experienced in my life regarding these matters. So thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you both for uh, what you shared. I think it's enriching of not just my understanding of Martinus, but dare I say the truth. Uh, but yeah, just a closing thought about how Martinus situates himself not as like the second coming of Christ, but more as a vessel for the Holy Spirit,
Mm.
a spokesman.
Yeah,
Um,
he's not the spokesman, but his cosmology, the ideas, that's the spokesman, the Holy
right.
Ghost.
Right. So he's offering like a kind of holy knowledge
Yes,
that others can then come to know and not rely on him as the authority of it, but know for ourselves, right? That
Exactly.
is true. Yeah.
Uh, I just had, I guess, maybe just speak very briefly about this, but my understanding of the role of love in mysticism, I think, is best encapsulated by Simone Weil's concept of decreation, where we, through the practice of unconditional love for whatever happens to us and for the world, there's a diminution of the ego, of the created individual in order for there to be a union with the divine. I see that in Bergson, I see that in Martinus. Um, and so I was just wondering if in Whitehead there's a similar focus, if there is a kind of unified view of mysticism between these three figures and how they saw the relationship between love and the self and the divine.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, Whitehead is, I think, conducive to his metaphysics is conducive to interpreting mystical experience, and he makes reference to mystical experience, but he's not at home describing his own such experiences, nor does he really um, dwell in that area. But I think um, you could say that when he talks about the primordial nature of God being ingredient in each moment of our experience as finite creatures, as an initial aim, if we can get our own sense of mistaken identity out of the way, where that mistaken sense of identity would be that which leads us to imagine that we're just this skin encapsulated ego, to use Alan Watts's terms, cut off from the divine, cut off from the universe, cut off from other people. If we can see through that abstract conception of what we are and really feel into this initial aim, we discover, in Whitehead's sense, he says this at the end of Process and Reality, that the kingdom of heaven is with us now. The day of judgment is today. And we don't need to to wait for some, you know, I mean, he has a teleological picture of the evolution of the universe, but the divine is as present now as it's ever going to be. And the guiding lure, the persuasive sort of aesthetic draw that God is offering is unique to each of us and to each moment of our lives. And it's just there waiting for us to attend to it, you know? And I think there's a real gift in that, as abstractly as he can often try to convey the structure of this cosmos and of our human experience within it. He's pointing us to that mystical insight, you know, of the eternal present in each moment. So,
okay, that just kind of it reaffirms what my intuitions about what it's all about.
yeah. Well, lovely to spend this Friday with you too. Um, let's keep the conversation going. Happy to read some
Enjoyed.
other texts by Martinus and just explore together. This was a lot of fun and enriching. So yeah, thank you both.
Yeah, thank
Thanks.
you. Thanks, Karsten. Yeah.
Thanks, Pedro. Glad you were here.
Yeah.
So see you guys.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.